Okay, here we go. And for our opening prayer this morning, I have adapted something from a book that I've really come to appreciate. And of course, I can't find it now to show it to you, but it's called All Desires Known, and it's got some just wonderful prayers. And so let us pray. May the power of God this day enable us, the nakedness of God disarm us, the beauty of God silence us, the justice of God give us voice, the integrity of God hold us, the desire of God move us, the fear of God expose us to the truth, the breath of God give us abundant life. Amen.
Amen.
So, by my recollection, and the good thing about having the recordings now is I can go back and double check. So I'm no longer scrambling, wondering. Last week we read the first part of Mark 6, and now we're going to pick up at verse 30 today. But before we do that, I just wondered, did anyone want to go back and revisit anything? Last week we talked about Jesus returning to his hometown, which of course is considered Nazareth. And what happened to him there?
Can anything good come out of Nazareth?
Yeah. So what happened in Nazareth last week?
I'd say that first he dazzled them, and then they rejected him.
Exactly. Yep. And why did they reject him? Anybody?
Because he was too familiar.
Yeah. Didn't compute for them that one of their own would be able to speak this way. Good. And then we moved on from Nazareth, and then we heard about the death of John the Baptist at the hands of Herod. Did anyone want to say anything, revisit anything from that conversation last week about why Herod executed John the Baptist? And
I was gone by the time of that discussion. Did you discuss why in the world this is put in here?
Good question.
Yeah, did we discuss that? I don't know that we addressed that question.
No, I don't think so either, because I was thinking that myself right now.
Well, why might that be?
Well, the lead in to it is, but when Herod heard of it, he said, John, whom I beheaded, has been raised. This is in the section where people are speculating whether Jesus is Elijah or John or some other Old Testament prophet. And it's kind of, then they go back retrospectively to tell what the story was of what Herod did to John and about the dancing girl and all that.
Beautiful.
I guess the only thing I could think of it was that it started with John the Baptizer. You needed somewhere in Mark to finish off or tell us what happened to him. But it just struck me that this was kind of stuck in here, and the story of Jesus could certainly have gone on without that vignette.
Did anybody know why Herod had been able to marry his brother's wife? Did his brother die?
Yes.
Wasn't it required under Jewish law that you marry?
Yeah, that's what worried me. Yeah.
It was required that you give your brother an heir. That doesn't necessarily mean a marriage, I think.
Well, marriage would seem to be the more honorable solution under those circumstances.
Well, for our eyes, it is. But I mean, they had concubinage of all kinds.
Yeah.
I have no certainty on that, Fred. It struck to me that the commandment was pretty specific, and our mind leaps to marriage.
Well, and I think it might be whatever the translation of the law would be, but you had to take her in, otherwise she was a burden to the
Yes.
whole tribe.
Well, hang on.
According to my study Bible, it says that for Herodotus, Josephus, the historian, said that it was not Philip's wife, but his mother-in-law, in which case that would have been illegal. So,
Oh my.
Well, and Amy
citing
Amy Jill Levine points us to Leviticus because Amy Jill says Mark presents John as a prophet who condemns Herod for violating Torah by marrying his brother's wife. And Torah says, "You shall not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. It is your brother's nakedness." So perhaps his brother is not yet dead. That is a possibility. Or his brother's mother-in-law.
Where does the responsibility for raising an heir to your brother come from?
Oh,
And
that's,
could that not be defined as just finding the woman another husband rather than you doing it yourself?
Good
Well, I think
question.
it would,
Oh, go ahead.
But is that in Leviticus also, or?
That I don't know.
I understood that as meaning that he would be providing an heir for the brother.
Mm-hmm.
So it would be the family's gene pool preserved, so to speak, rather than anything else. It could have been. It probably wasn't just one thing.
Well, and
Isn't that what-
widows,
sorry.
I was going to say widows, without family were
Exactly.
very low status in that particular era.
They would be completely unprotected if they didn't have a man looking out for them. Elin, what were you going to say?
Isn't that what Henry VIII was saying about him having married his dead brother's wife?
Yeah, Catherine.
The reason for a divorce?
Yes.
It was
But-
his specious reasoning. Yes.
Yes.
But he had to find a reason. So, okay, this is fine.
Yeah.
Of course.
Even
Yeah, I
Henry VIII can quote scripture.
Yeah, right. Henry
Well, he
and the
was named
devil.
a defender of the faith.
Well,
Yeah, but Henry was very educated.
okay, I think
Yes,
we're
he was.
starting to stray a little bit. So I'm going to bring it
Off track.
back, as interesting as this is. And so the question, it's a great question in terms of why it would be considered problematic for Herod to marry his brother's wife. So I'm starting to wonder if perhaps his brother was still alive, but I don't know. So that's something we can look into. But back to John's question about, why is it placed here? If we think about the arc of the gospel, and Mark doesn't waste a lot of language. So the fact that he would go back and insert this story, which is documented historically from Josephus, so we know it happened, that suggests to me that he's got a theological or a narrative agenda in mind. And I wonder if it's not meant to reinforce this line up here, about what happens to prophets are not without honor except in their own town. John the Baptist, as a prophet, winds up with his head on a platter. And it almost sounds to me like this is a warning that the stakes are high, that we have the empire, and then we have, the voice of the kingdom of God, right? John is mouthpiece, is the herald of the gospel. And so to me, it's almost like, if this were being dramatized, the music would turn into shift to a minor key and become sort of dire. So I wonder if it isn't meant to underscore the danger here. Because John, your point is exactly right. He could have just carried on without necessarily, he being Mark, could have carried on without going back and telling that story. And yet he chose to do that and to give it a fair bit of text there for Mark.
Mm, mm.
It's also he's preached across the sea with the Gadarenes and but now he's coming home and now he's really getting started. He started in Nazareth, but he's really beginning the program. He things out in Nazareth and said, okay, and we're moving on from there. And he's assigning the disciples their little routes, and it's all sort of introductory to the full story of his traveling and his preaching, because he sets up the disciples and cover the question from 14 to 16. Mark is describing how people are starting to become aware of him and trying to figure out where he comes from. It just getting the whole thing started, and Mark is going to establish these various facts. This is a good place to tuck in what happened to John. He has to finish telling that story, and then from now on, it's going to be the whole story of his preaching.
And it also gets John the Baptist off the stage in terms of the arc of the story.
Yeah. Wrap up that story and move on.
And as John mentioned, Mark starts with John the Baptist, so it would feel kind of incomplete if we never heard the outcome of what happened to him. All right, well, so now I've got a question for us. What is the only miracle story to appear in all 4 canonical Gospels? Who has a guess?
Feeding of the multitudes.
Beautiful. Yes. The feeding of the multitude, the loaves and fishes. You notice I said the miracle story because obviously the resurrection appears in all 4 of the canonical Gospels. But the feeding of the multitude, whether it's 4,000 or 5,000, appears in all 4 Gospels. And for biblical scholars, that's considered multiple attestation, which suggests it increases the likelihood that it actually happened. And we can debate, the mechanics of that, but something happened that all 4 of the canonical Gospelers over a range of time, probably 3 decades-ish, included it in their telling of the story of Jesus. And this is just, these are scans from Gospel Parallels. I know John uses this book, and if you all don't know this one, let me make sure I can show it to you. It has, as you see, it has these columns. It doesn't deal with John's Gospel. It's really just looking at the 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Synoptic meaning same eye, same view. John, of course, as we well know from having read John, most of us together, that he tells the story very differently. But we see how the 3 synoptic Gospels lay out the story. And in fact, we heard John's version of it this summer in that extended time where we were talking about bread week in and week out in church. But I just think it's very interesting to pay attention to that fact that all 3 of them tell that story, or all 4 of them rather tell that story.
Almost in the same words in some places.
Yeah. So having said that, would somebody like to read Mark's version of the story from 30 to 44? Anybody?
I'll do it.
Thank you.
Okay, Jesus feeds the 5,000. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed, he saw a large crowd. He had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. This is a remote place, they said, and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But he answered, You give them something to eat. They said to him, That would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go out and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? How many loaves do you have? He asked. Go and see. When they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. Then Jesus directed them all to sit in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 baskets of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of men who had eaten was 5,000.
Thank you, Fred. Wait, just out of curiosity, which translation are you using?
Oh, the New International Version.
I love when we have folks reading from different translations because it brings out different nuances. So that's great. Thank you. And the one on the screen is the New Revised.
I have 2 screens.
Cool.
Yeah, I have 2 screens and I can control this one.
Got it. Excellent. Okay, so very familiar story. Did any details jump out at y'all perhaps in a new way this time? Did you notice something? And again, it's great that Fred was reading a slightly different translation than what was on the screen, because that sometimes helps focus us on those details. What did you observe?
Well, in verse 41, what struck me, especially because of talking about this before, is that Jesus is the agent, that he takes the loaves and the fish, and he looks up to heaven, and he blessed and broke them. So, a lot of times people say, oh, well, they got out their private stores and they shared them. But this clearly says that Jesus is he looks to heaven for his power and then provides.
Beautiful.
But then he doesn't, it's interesting. He definitely is the agent, as you say. But when it comes to distribution, I mean, there's still only 2 fish. We don't know how many loaves of bread there are, but
5.
whatever there was had been blessed and broken. But that not yet multiplied. What are we to understand?
It was a miracle.
It was a miracle. 2 today.
I am influenced because I read Crossan's book on
Great.
this passage, and I don't want to go into it. I'll give you his take on it, but after other people have discussed the passage.
Well, I'm going to come back to you for that for sure, John, because I want to hear his take.
I like the extra explanation or clarification in Fred's text that 200 denarii is like half a year's wages.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just, otherwise you just have to look at the footnote. How much is that? That's quite a lot.
Always struck by the one they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties.
Yeah, what's that about, Fred?
I haven't a clue.
Okay.
That's why I brought it up.
Good. Okay. Does anyone have any thoughts?
I'm reminded of the rubrics in the old prayer book that used to say that people are to receive the communion decently and in order.
Yes. Don't want any wild spontaneity going on. Heaven forbid.
Well, Well,
Why not
that's, there's a rabbit hole to go down there, so let's not, but there is that sense of order.
Absolutely.
It almost sounds military.
Ah,
That is,
okay.
Ah,
Yes, exactly. Exactly. So groups of hundreds, what would that be?
Centurion
Ah,
command one.
beautiful. Beautiful. So why does Mark include that detail?
onward Christian soldiers.
Justifies his
Hmm.
counting.
Onward Christian soldiers. What'd you say, Fred?
Said it would justify his saying there were 5,000.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Good
They
way
get
to
a good
count.
count.
Or they numbered
Right.
five. Yours says they numbered 5,000 men.
Mm-hmm. And what was yours again? How
Just
did?
5,000.
Okay.
Maybe
No,
the
but I
women
thought you,
weren't
Fred, I
hungry.
thought you read the men who had eaten, because it clearly
Yeah.
was
Oh,
not.
the number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. Yours puts men at the back, but
Yeah. Those
I
are the
don't,
ones who counted.
I
maybe
don't
the
know if
women
it
weren't
was
hungry.
you, Patty, or some other pastor that I've heard over the many years I've been going to church, pointing out that if you have 5,000 men, you've got all the women and children on top of that.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, so these groups of hundreds and fifties, which to Ellie's point sound, militaristic. It sounds like the centurion. Sounds like we're talking about an army. What point might Mark be making in setting this up this way? I mean, maybe he was just describing it exactly as it happened, which is entirely possible. But again, because Mark is so sparse with his details, and he chose to say that.
Maybe it's to emphasize how organized the charity
Hmm.
should be.
Hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
As Ray says, in a decent order.
Yep. Yep.
I mean, people do not organize themselves. A large crowd doesn't organize themselves like that by itself.
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Even a small crowd doesn't organize itself that well. The expression "herding cats" comes to mind. Um, so one of the things that I think of when I focus on that detail about the groups of hundreds and fifties, um, going back to verse 34, as he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. That phrase, sheep without a shepherd, that's sort of a trigger, or a cue, I should say, going back to Hebrew scripture. From Numbers, let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, appoint someone over the congregation who shall go out before them and come in before them, who shall lead them out and bring them in, so that the congregation of the Lord may not be like sheep without a shepherd. And then the prophet Ezekiel, and this is God speaking, my sheep were scattered. They wandered over all the mountains and on every hill. My sheep were scattered over all the face of the earth, with no one to search or seek for them. And this image of sheep without a shepherd is sort of common parlance for folks who don't have a leader. So, which makes sense. So it's fascinating to me, going back to our buddy King Herod, right? So King Herod in his palace, wherever he is, off with his head with John the Baptist. We have this scene of, again, the scene of empire, right? And then we have this pastoral scene up in the Galilee, where they're kind of just wandering around with no one to organize and care for them. And then then they come into contact with Jesus, and they're hungry, and he has compassion. And suddenly, this group milling around, aimlessly, suddenly here they are organized. And I think Mark is trying to paint the picture of contrast here. that what
Hmm.
Jesus is creating. Because here you have King Herod, but these people, these people don't have anybody caring for them. Um, and so then it sets Jesus up to step in that role. That's how I read it, given the way the story unfolds and in this order.
I can share with you my study Bible, which says companies of hundreds and fifties were prescribed for aspects of community life among the Dead Sea sectarians.
Hmm.
And also, they refer to a passage in Exodus where they're setting up people to be officers. You take your best people, and they should be officers over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. So I guess these types of numbers echo in the Jewish traditions at that time.
And so it's a new Moses.
Well, I think it goes beyond Moses. I forget which one, but the beginning of 1 Kings, has the king sending a company of 50 to Elijah
Mm-hmm.
to bring him home. Elijah promptly incinerates them. He sends another 50 to,
That Ahaz?
yes, Ahab, that's right.
Yeah.
And Elijah incinerates them too. The third company just begged for mercy and managed to make it out alive. But obviously the Jewish army was organized in companies of 50.
Mm-hmm. So, what might Mark be suggesting here? And this is a very different kind of army, right? That's being organized. And how might we describe the people and what's happening in this scene?
They finally found a guide who
Mhm.
is, and the echoing of hundreds and fifties indicates just how very organized Jesus is.
Mhm.
In fact, I'm not sure that anyone has ever managed to organize sheep into groups of hundreds and fifties. They're
Yeah,
the stupidest animal on earth.
exactly.
But if Jesus can do it, man, I mean, he could herd cats too.
If anyone can do it, Jesus can do it. None of the rest of us could, but he could. I love that. Yeah, the the image of trying to just get sheep to move in one direction is, that's hard enough. What else do you observe here? Let me ask this, what time of year is it?
It's been spring or early summer.
Yeah.
The grass is green.
Yep, grass is green. And in this area, grass doesn't stay green very long. So it's most likely spring. N.T. Wright makes the point that it's most likely around Passover time.
Uh,
And so does that add anything to the story as we hear that detail?
So it tends to foreshadow the Passover dinner, the Last Supper
Yeah.
as well.
The breaking the bread among and sharing among the.
Beautiful. Because
well,
here
it also
oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Ray.
is, I think it's also, again, an echo of the Exodus and leading and feeding the multitudes who are as unruly as these sheep, and yet getting them through.
Beautiful.
And the idea of Jesus as the new Moses is a theme we hear again and again and again.
Mhm. And that's one that Matthew will really hit hard.
Yeah,
So in the wilderness, who feeds the people?
God.
God. With what?
Bread.
Manna from heaven.
Bread. Yes. And again, over the summer, good Lord Almighty, we heard that week after week after week about bread. So to that point about the Eucharistic imagery, the Passover meal, the Last Supper, if we look at verse 41, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven, blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples. Those are the 4 actions of the Eucharist that we hear week in and week out as we pray together the Great Thanksgiving. Take, bless, break. So Jesus is taking the food that is presented. He asks God's blessing. It must be broken in order to be shared, and then it is given abundantly. So clearly some Eucharistic imagery, Passover and Eucharist here.
There's a very different detail, though, between this and the manna from heaven,
Which is
in
what?
that he gathered up the remnants. In exile, they tried to gather up the remnants for the next day, and it all turned to mush.
Yep. That's a great. So glad you brought out that point, because that's right. Manna had a very short shelf life, right? And so it was not possible to store it up for the next day, which of course made the people of Israel utterly dependent day by day. Give us this day our daily bread. Really, obviously that's Jesus's prayer, but that really meant something. Yeah. There were no preservatives. There was no freezing. There was no, saving for the next day.
Except for the Sunday, Sabbath. They had to gather up enough on the day before to
Exactly.
that.
Because they couldn't work on the Sabbath. Beautiful.
Another miracle.
Anything else that maybe you noticed this read that you hadn't paid attention to before?
Well, I mean, it's a minor point, but when he first sees them, he regards them as sheep without a shepherd. Then he teaches, and they become subject to the discipline of and order, having been taught.
Beautiful. I don't think that's minor at all. I think that's actually really central to the story.
What about the 12 baskets?
Yeah. What
Yeah.
about
12
those
tribes?
Beautiful. 12 tribes, 12 disciples, 12 baskets.
12.
Kind of leads to speculate on who might have eaten the leftovers. How are they distributed and to whom and with what reason?
Yep, were
What
they
a
sent
mess.
home like doggy bags, with the various families? You take this will feed you tomorrow. There's a lot we don't know.
I have been to Orthodox services where there is bread that is blessed, not consecrated, but blessed and is sent home, sent out of the church with everybody to be distributed and eaten at some other time and place and with other people.
Beautiful. What about the way this passage begins? The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. What's that about?
Well, I was wondering about that. He sent them all out in pairs and don't take a bag and knock the dust off your shoes. He must have given them a time period to go out. Do you do this for a week? Do you do this for a month? How long has it been since he sent them out?
Yeah, that's a good question. And
they all came back at the same time.
Good point.
Yep, and we don't get that detail in terms of what the time period was. But clearly the apostles had a curfew. Come back by this point. Yeah, because it just says he called the 12, began to send them out 2 by 2, gave them authority, gave them instructions for how they were to travel, but the text doesn't tell us, come back in a week and report in. But somehow they knew to come back at this appointed time. They gather around him, they start reporting on all they've done and taught. And he wants to take them off on retreat. Come away to a deserted place and rest a while. Beautiful. Sounds great to me. And, oh, Ellie, was that
My,
you? Oh, go
yeah,
ahead.
I was going to say my question, my speculation is, what was Jesus doing during that period of time, whenever it was? Clearly, he was still preaching, because all of a sudden people are surrounding him so much that
Mhm.
there's so many people that you can't eat, you can't think.
Yep.
And the apostles come back. They've had a lot of experiences. They're footsore. Let's come away and talk about all of this.
Let's regroup.
Mhm.
And to your point earlier, Ellie, as we think about, if we imagine how the mission, the ministry is really beginning to take off now. So you're exactly right. Jesus had to have been carrying on by himself while they were off doing their missionary journey. And so he's active, he's teaching, he's preaching. Who knows what else? Has he performed more miracles that Mark just didn't record? We don't know. But then the apostles too have gone out, and what was their charge? What was the one thing that they were given authority to do?
Get rid of the unclean spirits, or
Yeah.
and probably also at the same, just they cast out many demons, but authority over the unclean spirits. And I think we were talking about, when we were reading this, it wasn't just people with various degrees of dementia or whatever, but the people's attitudes, the opposing thoughts. I don't know.
Mhm.
Bring them out. Try to soften the audience a bit. I mean, I'm almost seeing like the scouts that circuses used to send ahead of themselves, but to drum up business in the next town,
Sort of.
Interesting.
drum up interest.
Mhm. Ray, were you going to say something?
No, I'm admiring Ellie's point there.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really helpful image for them to be going out, kind of testing the waters, as it were, ahead of time. And then Jesus gives
Perhaps
them,
seeing which direction to go next.
yeah, Jesus gives them authority over the unclean spirits. And then this line, they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and cured them. So that almost reads like an afterthought, the cure piece. But all of this has happened. And now here they have come back together. And Jesus wants to have this moment of regrouping. Um, you know, Clearly the mission is gaining momentum, right? They have no leisure even to eat. So they go off in the boat to a deserted place by themselves. And that's when the multitude finds them. The paparazzi figure out where they've gone. Anything else here?
Well, can I give you Crossan's take on it?
Please do. I would love
to hear it.
that.
Because for him, it is a miracle, but not a miracle. To the extent he says this likely actually happened. And the way he describes it is that the people would not have gone off to a deserted place. In those days, you didn't have 7-Elevens, you didn't have Subways, you couldn't just pop in and get a Big Mac. That when you went on a trip, you took with you, about a day's worth of food if you were going to be gone for a day. And so and this is his theme of open commensuality. I don't know, Patty, if I'm saying that right, but
I think you are.
It's eating together and celebrating together, a theme that he puts throughout the Gospels, and says that the people got there and that, the disciples, the 12 among them, had 5 loaves and 2 fishes. All the people in the crowd probably some had more, some had less. And what they did is they then sat down with Jesus's example, they then sat down in the 50s and 100s and shared among themselves what they had brought with them, so that the 12 baskets afterwards, that's sort of the refuse. That was sort of, the pieces too small, the bones that got, again, for crossing. This is his take on it.
Great.
And I've always liked that, because that it takes some of the mystery of it, and it is the open sharing of food, of humanity, of everything that goes with it. So I was influenced by that. Every time I hear this story now, it takes some of the hocus pocus out of it.
Beautiful.
Seems to me getting people to share on that scale is a miracle in its own right.
It is. It clearly is a miracle.
And it strikes me, and I'm influenced because on Saturday, I attended the first session of our Tending Our Soil program, and Karen Edwards and Julie Anderson were there with me, and Stephanie Spellers, who is who works for the presiding bishop, and her particular area is evangelism and church growth. She gave a plenary talk when she talked about the church cracked open. And so I'm hearing that, and then this image of Jesus breaking the loaves, cracking open the bread, if you will. There's something about this crowd that gets cracked open as well, I think, to that point about if that's the way that it worked, then, to go back originally to what Donna was talking about Jesus as agent. Something is inspiring, something is causing this new way of being together. So that's very powerful to me, that this is an inflection point, right? That there's something that's being broken open among the group, and it's not just the bread that's broken. Other people have thoughts about that, about John Dominic Crossan's read of this miracle story?
I think it's a very rich interpretation.
Well, especially given that Jesus turns to the disciples and says, you give them something to eat. In other words, you have already within you the capacity to cause this to happen. Jesus may be the catalyst, and they can do this. And that may have been, the signal for the disciples to go and start organizing people. So it does make a lot of sense.
This is a reach.
We like reaches.
Well, I apologize if I'm really wrong on this, but a while ago I circulated a piece on primitive people, hunter-gatherers, even in our current day, coming up empty-handed from the hunt, coming back to the camp, and then sharing what was available, and no one went away hungry. I can circulate the piece if anybody's interested. That here, I read that as saying he's restoring human nature. There's something earlier where the sharing ethic was part of survival. Essential to survival, actually.
That's lovely.
The new Adam.
I just wanted to look at verse 42 for a second in the Greek, and I promise we will move forward. But this is the way that the NIV that Fred read, this is how it was translated. All ate and were satisfied. And personally, I prefer that translation to were filled, because yes, you can be full, but being satisfied to me has a psychological component to it as well. Maybe your stomach is full, but you're still not satisfied. We know plenty of people like that. So just that image of satisfaction, what does that look like? That's intriguing to me.
Well, you can be satisfied also without being stuffed.
Yep.
And so quantity is a variable and
Mhm.
selfishness is a variable.
Beautiful. And that satisfaction to me connects to Crossan's reading, that, and what you were saying, Ray, about getting people to share is a miracle in and of itself, and it really is. So, and we certainly know that now. Um, I'm just thinking about Haitian migrants at the, trying to come into this country and being sent back on a plane. Um, oh, there's nothing new under the sun in terms of human behavior. And so getting people, even if it's just for the duration of this meal, to do that, to think beyond themselves, to break down the barriers of their own little meal bag, um, that's powerful. Anything else before we push on?
Oh,
Okay. There's a lot in that story. It's obviously rich in symbolism. Um, and it's, to me, this is sort of the paradigmatic Christian story. I guess, makes sense that it is in all four of the canonical gospels. It's so central to who we are in relationship to Jesus, who we're meant, who God envisions us to be. Not who we are necessarily, but who God envisions us to be. All right. I think we could finish chapter 6. Would somebody like to read these three, either all three or part of these three paragraphs for us? Jesus walks on the water and healing the sick in Gennesaret.
You do it, John.
But I'll be happy to read it.
Thank you, John.
Immediately he made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After saying farewell to them, he went up on the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. And when he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came towards them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they came to the land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. And when they got out of the boat, the people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that he might touch even the fringe of his cloak. And all who touched it were healed.
Thank you, John. Again, a familiar story. What do you notice or wonder about, or what troubles you in this story? These stories, I should say.
In the beginning, it troubles me that he sent them to the other side, to Bethsaida, and there's no arrangement to come back for him or anything.
Mm-hmm. That's a great detail. Great point.
Why did they agree to leave him behind?
Mm-hmm.
he made them.
He's been trying to get some rest for a while before the feeding. So maybe he's finally saying, okay, really, well and truly enough. You go on ahead. And maybe there was some arrangement to come back and get him, just as there must have been an arrangement, regather here after you've been out on your mission, come back in this time. And maybe Mark just chooses not to include that.
I'm a little puzzled by 48, especially the first part. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came towards them. But then if they are, I can see him walking out to meet them if he sees that they're in trouble, but then why would he plan to pass them by? Pass them by
Great
him.
question.
Mhm.
What do y'all
How
think
does,
about that?
how does that translation work?
Let's find out. That's 48. Yeah, that was the verse that really jumped out at me this time. He intended to pass them by.
It seems fairly clear.
Mm-hmm. So I wonder why he would intend to pass them by. Any ideas?
Well, in verse 46, after he says farewell, he went up on the mountain to pray, but that's very heavy duty.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is kind of harkens to the times that he needs to find himself and find God. And
Mm-hmm.
Major reason he would pass them by to me is he, meant to meet him on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
And, that would imply that he's just sort of casually, as far as he's concerned, walking on water is just sort of the way to get from here to there.
Well, and what strikes me when you say that, Fred, is that in the previous scene where he tells the disciples, you give them something to eat, it may be that he really has no intention of rescuing them because he doesn't think they need to be rescued. That could be part of it. But he's, as you say, he's heading on to the other side. He's walking, he sees that they're in distress, but like a good parent who sees the kid who's, careening toward a tree on his bike, yeah, we're going to let him go a certain distance and then we'll rescue before he hits. I don't know.
He's
Maybe that
getting ready to
phrase is
cut
just
them
not
loose,
causative.
That's what it sounds like.
Sorry, you both spoke at the same time. Fred, what did you say? Fred?
I said it almost is like he's cutting them loose.
Hello?
Yep, I heard you. And then Ellie, you said maybe the phrase isn't causative. Do you want to say more about that?
Just that at the time he saw that they were straining at the oars, but he wasn't necessarily doing something about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have heard this another way, and I'd really like to know maybe what Crossman or somebody like Crossman says about this story. But two things strike me. One is that they started out in the evening, so they are on the water in the dark. They may not know where they are because of the wind and the currents. They may be very near to shore. And couple that with walking on the sea, and I always have trouble with prepositions. So the on has been translated by others as beside the sea, right at the shoreline, where it would not be impossible to be in fairly close contact with these people as the boat in the early morning light, Jesus can see it very nearby. And I don't have another, I don't know how any of this happens.
What's interesting to me, and I think I'm influenced by our conversation today about Moses, is, here we have Jesus up the mountain praying. Well, if we think about what happens when Moses goes up the mountain, what happens to the people of Israel?
They get themselves in
that's
trouble.
great.
They
And-
get themselves in trouble. Talk about being a sheep without a shepherd. I mean, and so, I hear that here too, is that here's Jesus,
Yeah.
finally having his time to center himself, to focus, to talk to his father, to pray deeply. And then no sooner does he go off than they get themselves in trouble. And again, these are mostly fishermen, right? Not all of them, but a lot of them are fishermen. So here they are out at sea, and even folks who are accustomed to being on the water are disoriented, they're scared. Um, there's something visceral that's happening to them. This isn't their normal daily schedule, their routine of going out in the boat and coming back at night with their nets loaded down with fish.
On that Moses reference, my study Bible says why he intended to pass them by is baffling. It may allude to God's veiled self-disclosure to Moses when he came down off the mountain, but veiled, and then goes on to point out the I am statement that then follows after that.
Beautiful. It is I. And I wonder if it's ego and me, which is the way John renders it. Let's see, verse 50. Well, yep, it is. Even though it's not hyperlinked here, I can see it. This here is a go, and this is a me. So it's the same construction that John uses every time he says, I am the bread of life, I am the good shepherd, I am the vine, etc. Beautiful.
Thank God for the study Bible.
Hey, exactly. They're
Millennia of people
tools.
thinking about this. This is
For a long time.
Mm-hmm.
it's benefiting all of us. I had
Exactly.
a question about 51 and 52,
Uh-huh.
and to the explanation that Ray was presenting, that that he could have been walking on the beach and they could be lost, and then just seeing him in the gloaming and think that he's on the water. But the fact that they were astounded, that the point is made that they didn't understand what a miracle the loaves were. So this was another miracle, that
Yeah.
they hadn't gotten to the point where they could recognize that Jesus was doing miracles. So
Right.
here they're astounded
Mhm.
just because they didn't get it the first time either.
Do you mean that you're referring to their hearts were hardened,
Yes,
meaning they still didn't get it,
right.
even though they had two miracles in a row?
Right, yeah, which implies to me that the second one actually was a miracle. I mean, he really was on the water rather than still on the beach.
Or it may be that they're astounded because the wind suddenly ceased when he got
Well,
into
there's
the
that
boat
too,
with
yeah.
them. Who else's heart is hardened in Scripture?
Pharaoh.
Pharaoh. So there's yet another connection. So in case we just missed it all together, there's yet another, and I think we're meant to, and certainly Mark's audience would immediately go bing, 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 to say their hearts were hardened. Ouch. And who hardened their hearts? Pharaoh's heart, according to Scripture, Yahweh, God, hardens Pharaoh's heart. So,
Why would God be hardening their hearts?
that's a good question. And maybe it's not God who's doing it. But that language is evocative of the Exodus story.
What if we translated that as if their hearts were not yet softened?
Let's see how the Greek does it. But their heart, singular, was hardened. Yeah. Calloused. Dulled, lose the power of understanding. And and apparently from poros, a kind of stone. So, yeah, and then I think about Ezekiel, where God says, I will give you a new heart. Instead of your heart of stone, I'll give you a heart of flesh. So this again is evocative of, of Hebrew scripture.
Could I refer to the Amy Jo Levine?
Yes, please. I was just
Okay. She says, each of Mark's feeding miracles is joined with a water miracle, evoking the Exodus example, God parting the waters, God feeding the people in the wilderness.
beautiful. Beautiful. So, yeah, we're definitely picking up on something that's there. That we're not. This isn't eisegesis. In other words, we're not, interpreting, bringing things in that aren't actually there. That we're right to hear these connections with the Moses cycle of stories, for sure. Anything else before we quit for the day? Let me just ask you this about verse. So this last paragraph sort of echoes back to things we've talked about before in Mark's gospel so far. People being brought to him on mats. Wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak, and all who touched it were healed. Now, that is most likely is meant to echo the woman. If we think about that Mark and sandwich we read a couple of weeks ago, with the healing of Jairus's daughter, and then the woman with the hemorrhage for 12 years. There's that number again. She reaches out and she says, if I can just but touch the hem of his garment. So it's that same impulse. N.T. Wright makes the point that I hadn't thought about before, that the fact that Mark describes Jesus wearing a cloak with a fringe is emphasizing his Jewishness. Which that detail had just passed me by every time, I will tell you. And so he makes that point. Anything else that strikes you?
Well, verse 51, thought of the day, he got into the boat with him and everything was all right. We're all in the same boat. If you got Jesus with you and you're with Jesus, things are good.
Beautiful. That'll preach. That definitely will preach. All right, well, let's wrap up here. Elin, we're going to lose you for a month, right?
Yes.
Well, we will miss you a lot.
Are you traveling?
Yes. Yes, certainly traveling.
I'm sorry.
I'm flying to London on Monday and I'll spend 3 weeks there. And then I'm flying to Athens and I'm going on a cruise.
Oh,
On
fantastic.
my own, because all the others have opted out. So I decided I'd do other trip. I've done other trips, many other trips on my own. I'll do this one on my own. So.
Oh, let me know. I'll come.
I know. I was offering to be a chaplain.
Yeah. And next time I'll take you up on it.
Yay. All right, friends. Well, Elin, we'll see you on Sunday before you go. And I'll see many of you next week. I'll see some of you on Sunday, but I'll see many of you next week here at the same time as always.
Okay.
All
Thanks,
right.
Betty.
Thanks, everybody. Be well.
Thanks, everybody.
Be well.